Now, there are many people who have always maintained that, in the Jonbenet Ramsey case, that her mother killed her in a frenzy of anger after the girl wet her bed or after she threw back into her mother's face a special Christmas present that her mother had shopped so carefully for. They will cite crime statistics that demonstrate that in most child killings, the perpetrator is later proven to be a family member. And they will proclaim that the mother's handwriting is almost a perfect match to the ransom note. And they will state that there were no intruder footprints in the freshly fallen snow leading to and from the crime scene. But one by one, especially after the FBI joined the investigation a year later, many of these fanciful theories and allegations against the mother have been abandoned or discounted by subsequent law enforcement investigators. So far as statistics go, the mother had no history of violence or anything like that, and the idea that she would just suddenly get mad and kill her daughter and strangle her and make it look like a sex crime and then make up and write such a complicated ransom note, it is really just ludicrous. And as for the ransom note, on a handwriting comparison scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being, quote, conclusive evidence that different individuals were responsible for the specimen and questioned documents, unquote, Patsy Ramsey scored just under 5, which is to say that while some of the experts concluded that she was a 5, and that it was almost impossible for her to have written the ransom note, the other experts, who, by the way, also determined that Patsy was an unlikely source of the note, could not 100% definitively eliminate her as the source, so scored her at just under the maximum of 5 on the scale, thus taking Patsy from a perfect 5 to below a perfect 5. And now there are many people who will say that 95% certainty that Patsy didn't write the note really means that Patsy cannot be excluded, so she did write the ransom note. What convoluted logic is that? And people will say that there could have been no outside intruder because there were no footprints in the freshly fallen snow going to and from the crime scene. But other evidence, such as detailed weather analysis for that date, has indicated that there was no snow in that area that night, and while there may have been frost on the grass, there was no frost on the walkways around the house. In law enforcement in general, sometimes it happens that when a group of Keystone cops or the police chief has tunnel vision and devises a theory as to who the culprit is, boy oh boy are his subordinates going to fall into line to validate his theory. In these types of situations, the, quote, in-house handwriting analyst will declare with exaggerated certainty that the suspect's handwriting cannot be excluded as the source for the ransom note. And if a lie detector test is given, the loyal technician will deceive himself through tunnel vision into declaring that there are signs of deception coming from the chosen suspect. I cannot tell you how many true crime documentaries I've seen on TV where, for instance, the police chief's guilty son passes the lie detector test with flying colors only to be proven guilty later through modern DNA testing. Things like this happen so often in some jurisdictions that they cannot be due only to the natural failure rate of the lie detector test. It is obvious and naked ambition when the technician will not dare to implicate the chief's son. And in fact, there have been countless cases where a suspect has falsely confessed to a crime that he didn't and couldn't have committed, in order to negotiate a life sentence instead of a certain death penalty after realizing that technicians and investigators were contriving false evidence. During these witch hunt situations, detectives don't initially set out to deliberately falsify evidence in league with each other, but that driving force of ambition and team cohesiveness still leads them all to the same common goal of framing the innocent target. One detective will assign the accused to share a cell with a known jailhouse snitch, who will then manufacture a false confession by using information provided by the ambitious detective. And another cop will manipulate an identification lineup. And yet another cop will creatively interpret a lie detector test, or a handwriting sample, or a bite mark, for instance. Which is one contributing reason why bite marks are no longer allowed as evidence in some states. And if the gullible suspect declines his right to silence and provides an alibi, the groveling and ambitious forensics technician might shift the time of death to fit in with the targeted suspect's unaccounted for hours that day. This has happened before. And then 20 years later, when modern DNA testing establishes that the convicted man could not have committed the crime, and that a different culprit was guilty, people wonder, why would a man falsely confess to a crime that he couldn't have committed? In certain towns like Chicago and in Louisiana, even judges so desperately want to run with their city's elite in crowd, the decision makers who are in the know of the city's happenings, that they seem to have no qualms about doing whatever it takes to avoid falling in status in the county's good old boys ruling club. Unfortunately, those are not rare occurrences, but are rather common and procedural in some jurisdictions in this country. In conclusion, when John and Patsy Ramsey refused to take the Boulder Police Department's lie detector test, and would only agree to take the lie detector test administered by their own chosen experts, and with their lawyers carefully scrutinizing the methodologies and the proposed questions to be administered on the lie detector, they were only being very wise, because by then it had already been established that the Boulder Police Department was trying to railroad them. And unfortunately, nothing enrages a borderline personality policeman or investigator or prosecutor more than when the target of his efforts thumb their noses at his hierarchy and fails to recognize his self-ideations of omnipotence and omniscience by declining to confess.